A young man of 32 years old died in a Babylonian palace, and the world he left behind was unrecognizable from the one he had entered. In the span of a single decade, he had crossed 3 continents, shattered the greatest empire the ancient world had ever known, and planted Greek cities from the Nile to the edge of the Indian subcontinent. His name was Alexander, and no conqueror before or since has reshaped civilization so completely, so quickly, or so permanently. This is the full story. It begins not with Alexander, but with the rugged highland kingdom that made him possible, Macedonia, a land of silver mountains and river plains that the Greek world dismissed as barbarous. It follows the military genius of his father, Philip II, who forged an army unlike anything the ancient world had seen. It walks through every campaign, every city founded, every culture absorbed. It examines how ordinary soldiers, Persian satraps, Egyptian priests, and Bactrian farmers lived inside this vast, restless empire. And it follows what happened after, the wars of the successors, the Hellenistic kingdoms, and the civilizational legacy that shaped Rome, early Christianity, and Islamic scholarship. Alexander's shadow never truly lifted. The Greek language he carried east became the tongue of the New Testament. The cities he founded became crossroads of world trade. His story is still contested, still debated, still alive. If complete journeys through the rise and fall of empires speak to you, subscribe and stay with us. Every week brings the full story of a world that shaped history. The story starts long before the empire. It starts with the land. The land comes first. It always does. Before the armies, before the kings, before the name Macedonia meant anything beyond a rough highland dialect and a people the southern Greeks considered barely civilized, there was the plain. The Amathian plain stretches wide and pale in the early morning light, caught between the silver thread of the Axios River to the east and the slower, darker coil of the Haliakmon to the south. Reeds grow thick along the river banks. Herons stand motionless in the shallows. The Thamaic Gulf glitters at the horizon, close enough to smell on a westerly wind, far enough that the sea feels like a promise rather than a fact. To the north and west, the mountains rise without ceremony, limestone ridges folding into one another, their upper slopes thick with oak and pine, their passes narrow and cold even in summer. This is not the Greece of marble temples and open harbors. This is a harder country, a country that demands something from the people who live in it. The Macedonians who settled this landscape in the centuries before the great Greek city-states reached their height were not a single unified people. They were a loose confederation of tribal groups, Elimiote, Oreste, Lynceste, and others, each occupying a distinct valley or upland basin, each with its own chieftains, its own herds, its own memory of where it had come from. The lowland Macedonians of the Amathian plain gradually emerged as the dominant group, and from among them rose the dynasty that would define Macedonia's entire history, the Argeads. Their claim to legitimacy rested on a foundation that was part history and part myth. They traced their descent from Heracles, the great hero of Greek legend, and through him to the city of Argos in the Peloponnese. Whether this genealogy reflected genuine migration or was a later political invention designed to secure Greek credentials remains a matter of scholarly debate. What is certain is that the claim mattered. In a world where divine ancestry conferred authority, the Argeads used it deliberately and consistently. The earliest Argead kings are more shadow than substance. Perdiccas I, credited in ancient tradition with founding the dynasty sometime in the 7th century before the Common Era, is a figure known largely through later accounts. What archaeology confirms is that by the late 7th and early 6th centuries, a recognizable Macedonian royal culture had begun to crystallize around the site of Aegae, nestled at the foot of the Pierian Mountains near the modern village of Vergina. Aegae was not a city in the Greek sense. No agora, no grand colonnaded temples, no dense urban fabric. It was a royal seat, a place of ceremony and burial, where the Argead kings performed the rituals that bound the kingdom together. The tombs cut into the hillside at Aegae speak quietly, but with great authority. Beneath the earthen mounds, burial chambers hold bronze vessels, iron weapons, gold jewelry of restrained elegance, and the bones of men and women who lived and died in a world still finding its shape. The kingdom they ruled was perpetually under pressure. Illyrian tribes pressed from the northwest with a ferocity that periodically shattered Macedonian armies and carried off cattle, hostages, and territory. Thracian confederacies pushed from the east, controlling the silver-rich slopes of Mount Pangaion across the Strymon River, wealth that Macedonia could see but not yet reach. The great Greek city-states to the south regarded Macedonia with a mixture of condescension and strategic calculation. Athens wanted Macedonian timber for its warships. Sparta watched the northern frontier with cautious eyes. Neither treated Macedonia as an equal, yet within this pressure, something was being built. The heteroi, the companions, formed the social and military core of Macedonian aristocratic life. These were the great land-holding families of the plain, men who rode beside the king in the hunt and in battle, who drank with him at long symposia, who owed him personal loyalty rather than civic obligation. The relationship between king and companions was not the abstract loyalty of a subject to a state. It was intimate, competitive, and volatile, a bond forged in shared danger and sealed with wine and land grants. This culture of personal kingship, so different from the institutional frameworks of Athens or Sparta, would prove to be both Macedonia's greatest strength and its deepest vulnerability across the centuries to come. In the winter of 359 before the Common Era, Macedonia stood at the edge of dissolution. The Illyrian king Bardilis had just destroyed a Macedonian army in the western highlands, killing the reigning king Perdiccas III along with 4,000 of his soldiers. The kingdom's northern and western frontiers were open. Pretenders to the throne circled from every direction, backed by Thracian gold and Athenian ambition. Into this collapse stepped a 23-year-old prince who had spent 3 years as a political hostage in Thebes and who had used that time to study, with extraordinary attention, how the finest army in Greece actually worked. Philip II did not inherit a kingdom. He inherited a crisis. And his first act was not conquest, but reconstruction of the army, of the treasury, of the idea of what Macedonia could become. The military transformation Philip introduced was not a single invention, but a system. At its center stood the sarissa, a pike of approximately 18 feet in length, made from the tough cornel wood of the Macedonian highlands, tipped with an iron point, and counterbalanced at the rear with a bronze butt spike. No individual soldier could wield it alone with full effect. The sarissa was a collective weapon, designed to function within a formation where the pikes of the first 5 ranks all projected beyond the front line simultaneously, creating a bristling wall of iron that no conventional infantry could penetrate. The men who carried it, the pegetairoi, the foot companions, were trained to move this formation with a discipline that Greek hoplite armies, fighting as individual citizen soldiers in loose civic levies, could not match. But the phalanx was only half the system. Philip paired it with the hetairoi cavalry, the companion horsemen of the Macedonian aristocracy, deployed on the right wing in a wedge formation capable of accelerating into a gap torn in the enemy line. The oblique advance was the tactical signature. The phalanx engaged the enemy center and left, pinning and pressing, while the cavalry on the right drove through the weakest point and wheeled inward. The enemy was not merely defeated. It was enveloped. To fund this machine, Philip moved with equal speed on the economic front. The capture of Amphipolis in 357 before the Common Era gave Macedonia control of the silver and gold mines of Mount Pangaion. The revenue that flowed from those mines, eventually reaching perhaps 1,000 talents per year, allowed Philip to pay professional soldiers year-round, to build siege equipment, to mint coinage that circulated across the Aegean world, and to construct at Pella a royal capital worthy of the power he was assembling. The palace at Pella rose on a commanding terrace above the city's grid of streets. Its floors were laid with pebble mosaics of extraordinary refinement, hunting scenes, mythological figures, lion hunts rendered in black and white and terracotta stone. The walls were painted, the colonnaded courtyards opened onto gardens. It was a statement in stone and pigment. Macedonia was no longer a peripheral kingdom. The Greek city-states watched Philip's expansion with alarm that came too late. Athens lost Amphipolis and could not recover it. The Chalcidian League was dismantled in 348 before the Common Era, when Philip razed Olynthus. Thessaly was brought under Macedonian hegemony. Phocis was crushed. Each move was calibrated. Military pressure combined with diplomacy, bribery, and strategic marriage. Philip married 7 times, each union cementing an alliance or neutralizing a rival. The final reckoning came on the plain of Chaeronea in Boeotia in 338 before the Common Era. Athens and Thebes, at last united in opposition, met the Macedonian army in open battle. The Sacred Band of Thebes, a corps of 300 elite soldiers who had never been broken in the field, held the left wing. Philip commanded the Macedonian right. His 18-year-old son Alexander led the companion cavalry. The oblique advance unfolded precisely as designed. The Sacred Band was surrounded and destroyed to the last man. Athens surrendered. Greece, for the first time, had a single hegemon. Philip organized the conquered Greek world into the League of Corinth, a formal alliance under Macedonian leadership, nominally voluntary, practically binding. He announced a pan-Hellenic campaign against Persia. The preparations were underway when, at a wedding celebration at Aegae in 336 before the Common Era, Philip II was stabbed to death by one of his own bodyguards, a man named Pausanias of Orestis. The reasons behind the assassination remain debated across ancient sources. What is certain is that Philip fell in the theatre he had built, in the city of his ancestors, at the height of his power. He was buried in a vaulted tomb beneath a great mound at Aegae, a chamber lined with painted frescoes, furnished with gold and ivory armor, a golden larnax bearing the star of the Argead dynasty. The hammer had stopped, but the engine it built was already in motion. The hammer had stopped, But the man who picked it up was 20 years old, and the world did not yet know what that meant. Alexander III inherited a kingdom already coiled for war. The army was assembled, the treasury was stocked with silver from the Pangaion mines, and the League of Corinth had pledged its allegiance to Macedonian leadership. But allegiance given to a father is not automatically transferred to a son. The moment Philip fell in the theatre at Aegae, every rival, every nervous ally, and every restless enemy began to calculate. Alexander understood this with a clarity that would define everything that followed. He moved before they could act. Within days of Philip's death, potential claimants to the Macedonian throne were eliminated. Attalus, a powerful Macedonian noble whose niece Cleopatra had borne Philip a child, was killed on Alexander's orders while commanding troops in Asia Minor. Other rivals, real or perceived, were removed with the same cold efficiency. The Macedonian assembly, which held the traditional right to acclaim a king, confirmed Alexander without significant opposition. He was young, but he had been trained for exactly this moment, not only by Aristotle at the garden school at Mieza, where the philosopher had taught him medicine, rhetoric, philosophy, and the geography of the known world, but by years riding beside Philip in campaign, commanding the companion cavalry at Chæronea at the age of 18. The Greek city-states read Philip's death as an opportunity. Thebes and Athens stirred immediately. Demosthenes, the great Athenian orator who had spent a decade warning against Macedonian power, reportedly celebrated in the streets. Thebes went further. It moved to expel the Macedonian garrison stationed at the Cadmea, the citadel that Philip had placed there after Chæronea. Alexander's response was not diplomatic. In 335 before the Common Era, he marched south with an army of extraordinary speed, crossing from Macedonia into central Greece before the city-states had fully organized their resistance. Athens fell silent. Thebes stood alone. The destruction of Thebes was total and deliberate. The city was razed to its foundations. Its population, estimated at tens of thousands, was sold into slavery. The temples were spared, as was the house of the poet Pindar, whose lyric verses Alexander had studied and admired. That single act of preservation, amid the systematic annihilation of everything else, was itself a message. Alexander knew his Greek heritage, honored it selectively, and would not be lectured about it by those who had underestimated him. The ruins of Thebes would stand as a warning for the remainder of his life, visible to every Greek who considered resistance. The effect was immediate and absolute. Athens sent a delegation of apology. The other Greek states reaffirmed their loyalty to the League of Corinth. Alexander was confirmed as hegemon, supreme commander, of the Pan-Hellenic campaign against Persia. He returned north to Pella, where the final preparations for the greatest military expedition the Greek world had ever attempted were already consuming the royal administration. The army that would cross into Asia numbered approximately 37,000 infantry and 7,000 cavalry. Among the men who rode with Alexander were figures who would shape the next decade of history. Hephaestion, his closest companion since childhood. Ptolemy, a sharp-minded officer of possible royal blood. Craterus, a steady and beloved commander of the infantry. And the veteran general Parmenion, who had served Philip for 30 years and now served his son. These men formed the inner circle of a court that was simultaneously a war council, a brotherhood, and a pressure vessel of competing ambitions. In the spring of 334 before the Common Era, Alexander stood at the Macedonian coast near Sestos, looking across the narrow water of the Hellespont toward Asia. The crossing point was barely a mile wide. On the far shore lay the Troad, the ancient landscape of Homer's war, and beyond it the vast Persian Empire of Darius III, a domain stretching from the Aegean coast to the borders of India. Alexander was 22 years old. He had already destroyed a Greek city, silenced a continent, and built an army that had never lost a battle. The world was about to learn what the engine Philip built, now driven by a different hand, was truly capable of. The water of the Hellespont is cold even in spring, and narrow enough that a man standing on the European shore can make out the shapes of trees on the Asian side. In May of 334 before the Common Era, Alexander led his army across that strait, not by swimming or by stealth, but by a fleet of triremes and transport vessels that carried roughly 37,000 infantry and 7,000 cavalry from the coast of Thrace into the Troad. The crossing was deliberate, ceremonial, weighted with meaning. Alexander himself steered his own trireme to the midpoint of the channel and sacrificed a bull to Poseidon, pouring libations into the sea. When the prow touched Asian soil, he was the first man ashore, leaping onto the beach in full armor, hurling a spear into the ground as if claiming the continent itself as a gift of the gods. Before the campaign began in earnest, Alexander turned south toward the ruins of Troy. The site was ancient even then, a place of crumbled walls and sacred memory, where the Iliad's heroes had bled for 10 years over a city that Homer had made immortal. Alexander moved through that landscape with the deliberateness of a man performing a rite rather than a tourist visiting a monument. He laid a wreath on the tomb believed to belong to Achilles. His companion Hephaestion placed one on the tomb attributed to Patroclus. The symbolism was unmistakable to every Greek and Macedonian present. Alexander saw himself as a new Achilles, a hero stepping into an epic already written, now continuing it eastward. The Persian satraps of western Anatolia had not been idle. They gathered a combined force of perhaps 20,000 cavalry and an equal number of Greek mercenary infantry on the eastern bank of the Granicus River, a fast-moving stream that cuts through the Troad plain before emptying into the Propontis. The Persian commanders chose the position deliberately. The steep, eroded banks of the Granicus would slow any cavalry charge and expose attackers to missile fire from above. The Greek mercenary commander Memnon of Rhodes reportedly urged a defensive strategy: avoid battle, withdraw, burn the countryside, deny Alexander supplies. The Persian satraps overruled him. Pride and the logic of their position demanded a direct confrontation. The battle came in late May. Alexander's cavalry struck first, crossing the river obliquely under heavy fire, climbing the crumbling banks, while Persian horsemen drove downward with javelins and sabers. The fighting at the riverbank was close, brutal, and nearly fatal for Alexander himself. 2 Persian noblemen, Spithridates and Rheusaces, broke through to Alexander directly. Rheusaces struck him with a sword, splitting his helmet. As Spithridates raised his arm for a killing blow, Alexander's companion Clytus the Black severed the Persian's arm at the shoulder. The king survived by seconds. The Persian line, deprived of its cavalry coordination, broke. The Greek mercenaries, abandoned on the field, were surrounded and largely massacred, a deliberate message that Greeks who fought for Persia against the Hellenic League would receive no quarter. The victory opened western Anatolia. Sardis, the ancient Lydian capital and the administrative center of the Persian satrapy, surrendered without resistance. Alexander appointed a Macedonian governor, but retained the existing Persian administrative structure beneath him, a pattern that would define his imperial management for the rest of the campaign. The Ionian Greek cities along the Aegean coast, Ephesus, Priene, Magnesia, were declared free, their oligarchic pro-Persian governments replaced by democratic councils. At Ephesus, the great temple of Artemis, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, received Alexander's personal offerings. The city's population, volatile and politically fractured, was restrained from executing Persian collaborators only by Alexander's direct intervention. Miletus resisted, relying on the imminent arrival of the Persian fleet. Alexander moved faster. His own fleet blockaded the harbor before the Persians arrived, and the city fell after a brief siege. The decision that followed was strategically radical. Alexander disbanded most of his own fleet, keeping only a small number of vessels. The Persian navy was formidable, Phoenician and Cypriot squadrons that outnumbered his own. Rather than fight at sea, Alexander chose to eliminate the Persian fleet's purpose by capturing every port along the eastern Mediterranean coast. Without harbors, the fleet would have nowhere to resupply, nowhere to winter, and no strategic value. The sea would be conquered from the land. Halicarnassus, the capital of Caria, proved harder. The city was fortified, garrisoned by Persian troops and Greek mercenaries under Memnon of Rhodes, and defended by the Persian fleet anchored in its harbor. The siege lasted through the summer and into autumn of 334. Alexander's engineers brought up siege towers and battering rams. The defenders sallied repeatedly, burning equipment and fighting in the rubble of demolished walls. Eventually, the garrison withdrew to the citadel and the offshore island of Kos, and Alexander declared the city taken, though the citadel held out longer. He appointed Ada, the deposed queen of Caria who had allied herself with him, as satrap of the province. She had offered him the kingdom. He gave it back to her and kept moving north and east, the coast of Asia falling behind him like a door swinging slowly, irrevocably shut. The road north and east from Halicarnassus climbs through limestone hills before opening onto the vast interior plateau of Anatolia, a landscape of pale grass, salt lakes, and distances that seem to expand the longer one travels through them. This was Phrygia, ancient and wind-scoured, a land that had known Hittite chariots, Persian satraps, and Greek colonists without ever quite belonging to any of them. Alexander's army moved through it in the autumn and winter of 334, accepting the surrender of cities that had no appetite for resistance and garrisoning the ones that did. Sardis, the old Lydian capital with its vast treasury, had opened its gates without a fight. The momentum was gathering, and the plateau offered little to slow it. At Gordium, the ancient Phrygian capital on the Sangarius River, the army wintered and was reinforced by fresh troops from Macedonia. The city was modest by Persian standards, a place of mud-brick walls and dusty markets, but it held something that had accumulated symbolic weight across centuries. In the temple of Zeus stood an ox cart whose yoke was bound to its pole by an intricate knot of cornel bark, so tightly woven that no end could be found. Local tradition held that whoever untied it would rule all of Asia. Alexander approached the knot, examined it, and, by one account, drew his sword and cut it through. By another he found the hidden pin that held the yoke and removed it, letting the rope fall loose. Ancient sources disagree on the method. What they agree on is that night, thunder rolled across the plateau, and the army took it as divine confirmation. Whether the act was theatrical or instinctive, it was perfectly timed. The army needed a sign. Alexander gave them one. Spring brought the march south through the Cilician gates, a narrow defile cut through the Taurus mountains, where the road narrows to a few meters between sheer rock walls and a rushing stream. A small Persian force could have held it indefinitely. Instead, the garrison withdrew at Alexander's approach, and the army poured through into the warm coastal plain of Cilicia. At Tarsus, a prosperous city on the Cydnus River, Alexander plunged into the cold mountain water to bathe, and was seized almost immediately by a violent fever. For days he lay incapacitated while his physicians debated treatment, and his generals waited in barely concealed alarm. His doctor Philip of Acarnania administered a purgative draught that the general Parmenion had warned might be poisoned. Alexander drank it anyway, watching Philip's face as he did. The fever broke. The campaign resumed. Darius III had spent the intervening months assembling an enormous army at Babylon and marching it westward. The two forces maneuvered through the autumn of 333 in a strange near-miss across the Amanus mountain range, each briefly occupying ground the other had just left. Then, in November, they found each other on the narrow coastal plain at Issus, where the mountains press close to the sea and leave almost no room to deploy. The terrain nullified the Persian numerical advantage entirely. Darius had chosen, or been forced onto, a battlefield that suited his enemy perfectly. The Macedonian phalanx pushed across the Pinarus River under heavy fire. The cavalry on the right, led by Alexander personally, drove hard at the Persian left and broke it. Darius, watching the line collapse toward him, turned his chariot and fled. The Persian army, leaderless, disintegrated. Left behind in the camp were the royal women, Darius's mother Sisygambis, his wife Statera, and his daughters. Alexander visited them the following morning and, according to every ancient account, treated them with formal respect, addressing Sisygambis as a queen and assuring her of her safety. She had initially prostrated herself before Hephaestion, mistaking him for the king. The moment passed without humiliation. Darius sent his first peace offer shortly after. His family returned in exchange for territory and alliance. Alexander refused. The road south lay open, and he intended to walk every mile of it. The Phoenician coast in the winter of 332 before the Common Era is a landscape of cedar-dark headlands and shallow harbors, where the sea runs green close to shore and deepens to indigo beyond the offshore reefs. It is here, on a rocky island sitting roughly half a mile from the mainland, that the city of Tyre rises from the water like a fortress that has grown too proud to touch the earth. Its walls reach nearly 150 feet in height on the seaward side. Its harbors, one facing north toward Sidon, one facing south toward Egypt, are deep enough for warships and sealed by chains. The Tyrians have watched armies come and go along this coast for centuries. They believe the sea protects them. They are not entirely wrong. Alexander arrives before Tyre in January of 332, before the Common Era, and sends envoys requesting entry to sacrifice at the temple of Melkart, the city's patron deity, whom the Macedonians identify with Heracles. The Tyrians refuse. They offer a compromise, sacrifice at a temple on the mainland. but Alexander understands what refusal means in strategic terms. Tyre controls the finest harbour on the Levantine coast. Left unsubdued, it could serve as a base for the Persian fleet to threaten his supply lines and potentially reignite resistance behind him. The siege begins. What follows is 7 months of engineering on a scale the ancient world had rarely attempted. Alexander's engineers begin constructing a mole, a causeway of stone, timber, and rubble, stretching from the mainland shore out across the half-mile of shallow water toward the island walls. The work is slow and dangerous. Tyrian warships harry the construction crews. Fire ships are sent against the wooden towers raised at the mole's advancing edge. The first towers burn. The mole itself is damaged. Alexander orders it rebuilt, wider and stronger, and requisitions timber from the cedar forests of Lebanon, rising in the hills behind the coast. The turning point comes when Alexander assembles a fleet. Ships arrive from Sidon, Byblos, Rhodes, and Cyprus, cities that have already submitted until he commands more than 250 vessels. The Tyrian navy, outnumbered and blockaded in both harbours, loses the ability to maneuver freely. Siege towers are mounted on paired ships lashed together and brought against the island walls. Battering rams work at the foundations. In July of 332 before the Common Era, a section of the southern wall is breached. Macedonian soldiers pour through. The city falls after a resistance so fierce that Alexander's army shows little mercy. Ancient sources record that 8,000 Tyrians die in the final assault, and 30,000 are sold into slavery. 2,000 prisoners are crucified along the shore. The road south continues to Gaza, where the Persian garrison commander Batis refuses to surrender. The siege lasts 2 months. When the city falls, Alexander marches on into Egypt, crossing the Sinai Desert in roughly a week. At the border fortress of Pelusium, no resistance forms. The Persian satrap Mazaces, holding Egypt with minimal forces and no prospect of relief, surrenders without battle. Egypt opens before the Macedonian army like a door long waiting to be pushed. At Memphis, the ancient capital on the Nile, Alexander is received not as a conqueror, but as a liberator. The Persians had ruled Egypt harshly, showing contempt for local religious customs and the sacred Apis bull. Alexander sacrifices to the Egyptian gods, respects the priesthood, and is recognized as pharaoh, the legitimate ruler in the ancient tradition. The priests of Ptah and Amun welcome him. The Nile Delta, with its branching channels and papyrus marshes, stretches north toward the sea. It is on the Mediterranean shore of the delta, at a site called Rakotis, that Alexander marks out the boundaries of a new city in the spring of 331 before the Common Era. The founding of Alexandria, laid out along a grid between the sea and Lake Mareotis, is recorded by ancient tradition as occurring on the 7th of the month later called April. Then Alexander turns west into the desert, following the coastal road, and then striking south through the Libyan sand toward the oasis of Siwa. The journey takes weeks. At Siwa, the oracle of Amun speaks to him in the inner sanctuary. What was said remains unrecorded. Alexander emerges and tells his companions only that he received the answer his heart desired. The question of divine sonship, whether the oracle confirmed him as son of Amun, as son of a god, follows him for the rest of his life, and long after. He returns from Siwa carrying a silence that his companions learn not to question. By the spring of 331 before the Common Era, Alexander has left Egypt behind, marching northeast through the Sinai and back into the Levant. The army reassembles. Supplies move forward. The Macedonian war machine, rested and reinforced, turns its face toward the east, toward the Euphrates, toward Mesopotamia, toward the heart of the Achaemenid world. Darius III has not been idle. After his flight at Issus, the great king retreated deep into the Persian interior and spent the intervening months assembling the largest force his empire could produce. Ancient sources place his army at numbers that strain credibility. 1 million men, some claim. Modern historians, working from logistical realities and comparative evidence, estimate between 100,000 and 200,000 soldiers, cavalry from Bactria and Scythia, war elephants from India, scythed chariots designed to tear through infantry formations, and the elite Persian infantry known as the Immortals. Darius chose his ground with care. The plain near the village of Gaugamela, east of the Tigris River and north of the city of Arbela in the region of modern northern Iraq, was deliberately selected and partially leveled to give his chariots and cavalry room to operate. He would not be caught in a coastal defile again. Alexander crosses the Euphrates at Thapsacus in late summer, then the Tigris further north. His scouts report the Persian encampment. On the night before the battle, the 30th of September, Parmenion reportedly urges a night attack. Alexander refuses. The Macedonian army rests under a sky full of stars, while the Persian host, fearing exactly such a move, stands under arms through the darkness, exhausted before dawn arrives. The plain of Gaugamela on the 1st of October, 331 before the Common Era, is flat and pale under an early autumn sun. The Persian line stretches enormously wide, designed to overlap and envelop the Macedonian flanks. Alexander responds with an oblique advance, moving his line diagonally to the right, drawing the Persian left to follow, stretching and thinning their formation. The scythed chariots charge. Macedonian infantry open lanes, step aside, and cut down the horses from the flanks as the chariots pass through harmlessly. Then the moment arrives. A gap opens in the Persian center as cavalry units peel away to chase the Macedonian right wing. Alexander, at the head of the companion cavalry, drives directly into that gap in a wedge formation, straight toward Darius. What happens next is recorded in multiple ancient accounts with remarkable consistency. Darius, seeing the Macedonian cavalry bearing down on his position, turns his chariot and flees. The Persian center collapses. The left wing, already broken, dissolves. Only on the Macedonian left does the battle remain dangerous. Parmenion's forces are pressed hard, and a message reaches Alexander asking for relief. He turns back from the pursuit. Darius escapes into the night, raiding east toward Arbela and then further into the Iranian plateau. The Persian Empire, as a functioning military power capable of contesting the field, ceases to exist on that plain. Babylon opens its gates without resistance. The city's priests and administrators welcome Alexander as a legitimate ruler, a restorer of temples that the Persians had allegedly neglected. The treasury at Susa yields riches beyond calculation. Ancient sources record 50,000 talents of silver bullion alone, along with the accumulated wealth of generations of Achaemenid kings. At Persepolis, the ceremonial capital of the empire, the treasury holds another 120,000 talents in total across both sites by various ancient reckonings. The logistical challenge of moving this wealth requires thousands of mules and camels. Then comes the fire. In the spring of 330 before the Common Era, the great palace complex of Persepolis, its columned Apadana Hall, its gate of all nations, its painted and sculpted walls bearing the tribute processions of 30 subject peoples, burns. Whether the burning was a calculated act of political symbolism, revenge for the Persian destruction of Athens in 480 before the Common Era, or the result of a drunken celebration that escaped control, ancient sources disagree. The debate has never been resolved. What is certain is that the ash and char of Persepolis mark the end of something ancient and irreplaceable, and that Alexander, by some accounts, expressed regret the following morning when he saw what the flames had consumed. The ash of Persepolis is still settling when the army moves east. The road ahead is no longer the road of conquest as the Greek world understood it. No walled cities with known names, no satrapal courts with treasuries waiting to be opened, no populations who remembered Greek traders or Aegean coins. Beyond the eastern Iranian plateau, the world becomes something older and stranger, a landscape of wind-scoured steppe, salt desert, and mountain ranges that seem to have no end. The pursuit of Darius III is now the campaign's stated purpose. After Gaugamela, the Persian king had fled northeast toward Ecbatana and then further into the interior, accompanied by a shrinking retinue of loyalists and a growing number of men who understood that loyalty to a defeated king was a liability. Among those men was Bessus, the satrap of Bactria, a member of the Achaemenid royal family who had his own calculations about what the collapse of the empire might offer a man willing to act decisively. In July of 330 before the Common Era, somewhere in the desert south of the Caspian Sea, Bessus and his confederates stabbed Darius and left him dying beside the road. A Macedonian patrol found the body shortly after. Alexander, by ancient account, covered the corpse with his own cloak. The death of Darius transformed the campaign's meaning. Alexander was no longer liberating Greeks from Persian oppression or avenging the burning of Athens. He was now the legitimate successor to the Achaemenid throne, or so he claimed, and Bessus was a regicide and a usurper. The pursuit continued, but the terrain was changing in ways that no Macedonian veteran had experienced. The Hindu Kush rises to peaks of more than 7,000 meters, its passes choked with snow for much of the year. The army crossed into Bactria through passes that ancient sources describe as brutal, men losing fingers and toes to frostbite, horses dying on the ice, the supply lines stretched to breaking. Bactria itself, the region centered on modern northern Afghanistan, was not empty or primitive. It was a land of ancient cities, irrigated river valleys, and a population accustomed to governing itself at the edges of successive empires. Bessus had declared himself the new king of Persia under the name Artaxerxes V, but his support was thin. He was eventually betrayed by his own allies and handed over to Alexander in 329 before the Common Era. His punishment was the traditional Persian penalty for regicide, mutilation and execution. Alexander was performing the role of Achaemenid avenger with deliberate precision. But capturing Bessus did not end the resistance. In Sogdiana, the region north of Bactria, roughly corresponding to modern Uzbekistan and Tajikistan, a different kind of war began. The Sogdian aristocracy, led by commanders such as Spitamenes, refused to submit. They did not meet the Macedonian army in open battle. Instead, they raided supply lines, melted into the steppe, and drew Macedonian detachments into ambushes in terrain where the Sarissa phalanx was useless. Spitamenes destroyed an entire Macedonian force near the Jaxartes River, a defeat that ancient sources record with unusual candor. The guerrilla war in Bactria and Sogdiana lasted nearly 4 years and cost more Macedonian lives than any single pitched battle of the campaign. It was during these years that the internal fractures of Alexander's empire became impossible to ignore. In 328 before the Common Era, at a banquet in Maracanda, modern Samarkand, Alexander killed his companion Clytus the Black in a drunken quarrel. Clytus had saved Alexander's life at the Granicus. He had also that evening mocked Alexander's adoption of Persian customs and compared him unfavorably to his father Philip. The killing was immediate and unplanned. Alexander reportedly spent 3 days in grief and self-reproach afterward. The incident revealed something the campaigns had been slowly producing: a king increasingly isolated from the men who had known him before the diadem, before the Persian robes, before the divine pretensions. The attempt to introduce proskinesis, the Persian court ritual of prostration before the king, to his Macedonian companions failed completely. The philosopher Callisthenes, Aristotle's nephew and the campaign's official historian, refused publicly and was later arrested on charges connected to the pages' conspiracy, a plot among royal pages to assassinate Alexander. Callisthenes died in custody. The execution of the general Philotas on charges of treason and the subsequent killing of his father Parmenion, one of Philip's most trusted commanders, removed the last senior voice capable of openly challenging Alexander's decisions. The marriage to Roxane, daughter of the Bactrian nobleman Oxyates, in 327 before the Common Era, was both a political act and something more personal. It was the first formal marriage Alexander contracted. It bound him to the Eastern aristocracy he was trying to govern, and it signaled to the Sogdian nobility that submission would be rewarded with integration rather than displacement. The Hindu Kush waited again to the south. India lay beyond it, a world that even Alexander's maps could not fully describe. The Hindu Kush in late spring carries snow on its upper ridges even as the lower passes begin to open. The army crosses for the second time in 327 before the Common Era, moving south through the Kawak Pass into the valleys that descend toward the Indus watershed. The men have crossed these mountains before, but the direction is different now, and so is the weight of what lies ahead. Beyond the passes, beyond the river valleys of the northwest, lies a subcontinent that Greek geographical knowledge had barely sketched, a land of monsoon rains, war elephants, and kingdoms whose armies dwarfed anything the Macedonians had yet encountered. The campaign in the northwest of the subcontinent opens with sieges in the hill country. At Ionos, a great rock fortress rising above the Indus Gorge, a place that legend claimed even the god Heracles had failed to take, Alexander's engineers construct approach ramps across a ravine, filling the gap with timber and earth until siege platforms can be brought forward. The fortress falls. The symbolic weight of the achievement is not lost on the army. If Heracles could not take Aornos and Alexander could, the implication is clear. The campaign is framed not merely as conquest, but as the surpassing of divine precedent. The crossing of the Indus brings the army into the Punjab, a landscape of wide rivers, flat alluvial plains, and humid air that the Macedonians find disorienting after years of dry plateau and mountain. The kingdom of Taxila, whose ruler Taxil submits willingly and offers supplies and alliance, provides a forward base. But to the south and east, beyond the Hydaspes River, the king called Porus refuses submission. His army includes war elephants, perhaps 200 of them, and his infantry numbers in the tens of thousands. The Battle of the Hydaspes in May of 326 before the Common Era is fought in monsoon conditions, the river swollen and fast. Alexander crosses upstream at night with a portion of his force, using the sound of thunder to mask the movement of boats. The crossing is dangerous, the far bank is contested. But by dawn the Macedonian cavalry is across and moving to engage. Porus deploys his elephants across the front of his infantry line, hoping the animals will break the Macedonian cavalry charge. The Macedonian response is methodical. Infantry phalanxes press the elephant line while cavalry strikes the flanks, driving the animals back into their own troops. The battle is the hardest Alexander has fought since Gaugamela. Porus himself, wounded and still mounted on his elephant, is taken alive. When asked how he wished to be treated, he answers as a king. Alexander reinstates him as a vassal ruler over his own territory and expands his domain. It is a policy of integration that has served the empire before. The army pushes east from the Hydaspes, crossing the Assassines and the Hydraeotes, reaching the Hephaeses, the modern Bees River, in late summer of 326. Beyond it, according to reports brought by local informants, lie more kingdoms, more rivers, and eventually the great Eastern Ocean that Alexander believes marks the edge of the inhabited world. But the army will not cross. After nearly a decade of continuous campaigning, 10,000 miles from Macedonia, the men refuse to march further. Officers speak to Alexander of exhaustion, of wounds that have not healed, of families not seen in years. The refusal is not a rebellion. There is no violence, no mutiny in the military sense, but it is absolute. Alexander withdraws to his tent for 3 days. When he emerges, the order is given to turn back. The return is not a retreat, but it carries the weight of one. A fleet of perhaps 800 vessels, commanded by the Cretan admiral Nearchus, is constructed on the Hydaspes to carry a portion of the army down the Indus to the sea. The land columns march alongside the river. The campaign down the Indus is brutal. At the city of the Mali, near modern Multan, Alexander leads an assault over the walls himself and is struck by an arrow that pierces his lung. He collapses inside the city. The army outside, believing him dead, breaks through the walls in a fury. Alexander survives, carried out on his shield, but the wound takes months to heal. The army reaches the Indus Delta in the summer of 325. Nearchus sets sail westward along the Makran coast. The land columns begin the crossing of the Gedrosian Desert, a march that kills thousands through heat, thirst, and exhaustion. India recedes behind them, unconquered in its depths, but permanently marked by the cities, garrisons, and Greek settlers left along the Indus corridor. The desert crossing ends, but the empire does not rest. From the Gedrosian waste, Alexander moves back into the heartland of Persia, to Carmania, to Pasargadae, to Susa, and what he finds along the way disturbs him deeply. Satraps have governed corruptly in his absence. Treasuries have been plundered. Local populations have been abused. He removes governors, executes officials, and reasserts control with the same speed he once applied to battlefields. But between the acts of discipline, something else is taking shape, something quieter and more permanent than any campaign. The empire is not merely a military achievement, it is becoming a civilization. Across a territory stretching from the Adriatic to the Indus, more than 20 cities bearing Alexander's name have been founded or are under construction. They are not simply garrisons. Each follows a recognizable template, a grid of streets laid out on the Hippodamian plan, a central agora for commerce and assembly, a gymnasium where Greek language and athletic culture are transmitted to local populations, a theatre, a sanctuary. The agora and the gymnasium are the twin instruments of Hellenization, spaces where a young man from Bactria or Egypt or Mesopotamia can encounter the Greek world not through conquest, but through participation. Merchants, veterans, and settlers from across the empire fill these new urban spaces. Local craftsmen work alongside Greek architects. Coinage bearing Alexander's image, the lion scalp helmet, the eagle, the thunderbolt, circulates from Egypt to Sogdiana, creating a shared economic language across cultures that had never before been connected. The administrative structure beneath this urban network is a deliberate hybrid. Persian satraps continue to govern many provinces, their local knowledge and existing networks preserved. Macedonian officers sit alongside them as financial controllers and military commanders. The system is not seamless. Friction between Macedonian veterans and Persian officials is constant, but it functions. Tax revenues flow. Roads are maintained. The royal post, inherited from the Achaemenid system, carries letters and orders across thousands of miles with a speed that no previous Western empire had managed. At Susa in 324 before the Common Era, Alexander stages the most extraordinary ceremony of his reign. In a great pavilion hung with gold and purple, he and 91 of his senior officers marry Persian and Median noblewomen in a ceremony conducted according to Persian custom. Alexander himself takes Barsine, daughter of Darius III, and Parysatis, daughter of Artaxerxes III, as wives. The weddings last 5 days. 10,000 Macedonian soldiers who have taken Asian wives receive gifts and formal recognition of their unions. The message is unmistakable. The empire is not a Macedonian occupation of Persia. It is a new thing, fused from both. That same year, 30,000 young Persian men, trained for years in Macedonian military technique, drilled in the sarissa and the phalanx formation, are presented to Alexander at Susa. He calls them the epigonoi, the successors. To his veteran Macedonian soldiers, the sight is a provocation. These men are not auxiliaries. They are replacements, or so the veterans fear. The tension erupts at Opis, where the army mutinies. Alexander responds with characteristic force, then characteristic reconciliation. He dismisses the Macedonians who wish to leave, then holds a great banquet of reconciliation, where Macedonians and Persians sit together and drink from the same vessels. The exiles' decree, issued that same year and proclaimed at the Olympic Games, orders all Greek cities to restore their exiled citizens, a sweeping act that reshapes the political landscape of Greece and signals that Alexander considers himself sovereign over the entire Greek world, not merely its hegemon. The world Alexander has built is imperfect, contested, and unfinished. But it is real. In the new Alexandrias, children grow up speaking Greek alongside Aramaic and Bactrian. In the markets of Babylon, Macedonian soldiers spend Persian silver on Indian spices, carried along routes that did not exist a decade earlier. The gymnasium and the fire altar stand within sight of each other. The empire breathes. Babylon receives him in the autumn of 324 before the Common Era. The great city on the Euphrates, its walls wide enough for 2 chariots to pass abreast, its hanging gardens still fragrant above the baked brick terraces, its ziggurat of Etemenanki rising in stepped tiers toward a sky the color of fired clay, has been designated the imperial capital. Alexander intends to make it the center of the world he has built. But the world has already begun to contract around him in ways no campaign plan can address. The grief arrives first. Hephaestion, the companion of Alexander's entire life, the man who had stood beside him at Troy, ridden with him at Gaugamela, shared every tent and every feast from the Hellespont to the Indus, dies in Ecbatana in October of 324 before the Common Era. The cause is fever, following a period of illness during which Hephaestion reportedly broke his physician's dietary instructions. Alexander's response is not the composed mourning of a king. Ancient sources describe him lying beside the body for an entire day, refusing to eat, ordering the manes of all horses and mules, shorn as a sign of mourning, and tearing down the battlements of Ecbatana's citadel. He sends to the oracle at Siwa, asking whether Hephaestion may be worshipped as a god. The oracle's response, that he may be honored as a divine hero, arrives later, but the grief does not wait for divine sanction. A funeral pyre of extraordinary scale is commissioned for Babylon, its construction estimated by ancient sources to have cost 10,000 talents. The pyre rises in stages, a structure of gilded prows, painted eagles, torches, and carved lions, a monument not merely to a man, but to the part of Alexander that died with him. The campaigns continue even in mourning. A winter expedition against the Kosaean hill tribes of the Zagros Mountains serves, ancient writers suggest, as a kind of grief-driven war, a violent act of mourning carried out against a people who had long raided the lowlands. By early 323 before the Common Era, Alexander is back in Babylon, turning his attention to Arabia. Reconnaissance fleets have already been sent along the Arabian coast. A harbor is being expanded on the Euphrates to accommodate a new fleet of 1,000 warships. The Arabian campaign is conceived as a circumnavigation and conquest of the peninsula, a project that, if completed, would have extended Macedonian power to the Red Sea and beyond. The Babylonian astronomical diaries, clay tablets inscribed by temple scribes who recorded celestial events alongside earthly ones, note omens in the months before Alexander's death. A comet, an eclipse, a stranger found sitting on the royal throne. These were not invented after the fact. The diaries are contemporaneous records, and their anxiety is real. The priests of Marduk warn Alexander not to enter the city from the west. He enters anyway, or is redirected and enters by a different route. The ancient sources disagree on the details, but agree on the atmosphere of foreboding that surrounds his final weeks. In late May of 323 before the Common Era, after a long banquet at the house of his admiral Nearchus, Alexander develops a fever. It does not break. For 11 days he lies in the royal palace of Nebuchadnezzar, the Euphrates audible beyond the thick walls, his body failing with a speed that stuns his army. His soldiers, fearing he was already dead, demanded to file past him. He raised his hand to each of them as they passed. When his generals asked to whom he left the empire, the ancient tradition records that he said, or was said to have said, to the strongest. He died on the 10th or 11th of June, 323 before the Common Era. He was 32 years old. He had campaigned without pause for 12 years across more than 30,000 stadia of territory. The body, preserved according to some ancient accounts in honey or wax to slow its decay, lay in state for days before the Macedonian command could agree on what to do next. No heir had been named, no succession arranged. The empire breathes, but the breath has stopped at its center, and the silence that follows is the silence before a world comes apart. The silence in Babylon does not last. Within hours of Alexander's death, the men who had marched beside him, who had crossed rivers and mountains and deserts at his command, begin to position themselves. The infantry assembly and the cavalry officers cannot agree on a successor. Perdiccas, who held the royal signet ring pressed into his hand in the king's final hours, argues for waiting until Roxane's child is born. If the child is a son, he will be king. Meleager, commanding the Macedonian infantry, demands an immediate king of Macedonian blood, and finds one in Aridaeus, Alexander's half-brother, a man of limited capacity but undeniable lineage. For a brief and dangerous moment, the two factions face each other across the streets of Babylon with weapons drawn. A compromise is forced. Aridaeus will reign as Philip III, and Roxane's unborn son, born weeks later and named Alexander IV, will be co-king. Perdiccas becomes regent. The empire, on paper, remains whole. It does not remain whole for long. The settlement at Babylon distributes the satrapies among the generals like portions of a divided estate. Ptolemy receives Egypt and wastes no time in securing it. Antigonus, already governing Phrygia, consolidates his hold over Anatolia. Lysimachus takes Thrace. Antipater, who had governed Macedonia throughout Alexander's campaigns, retains the Macedonian homeland and Greece. Seleucus receives Babylonia. Each man understands that the arrangement is temporary, that the map drawn in Babylon is a starting position, not a final settlement. The wars that follow will last a generation. Perdiccas moves first, attempting to hold the empire together by force of the regency. He fails. His campaign into Egypt against Ptolemy ends in military disaster on the banks of the Nile, where his troops refuse a crossing that costs too many lives. His own officers kill him in his tent in 321 before the Common Era. The Treaty of Triparadisus, negotiated that same year in Syria, redraws the map again. Antipater becomes the new regent, Seleucus is confirmed in Babylon, and Antigonus is given command against the remaining loyalists. The empire is fracturing along the lines of personal ambition and geographic logic simultaneously. Antipater dies in 319 before the Common Era, and his death removes the last figure with sufficient standing to hold the Macedonian heartland stable. His son Cassander seizes Macedonia, and what follows in the homeland is brutal. Olympias, Alexander's mother, returns from Epirus and has Aridaeus and his wife Eurydice killed. Cassander responds by besieging Olympias at Pydna. She surrenders and is executed in 316 before the Common Era. The mother of Alexander, killed by a Macedonian general in the kingdom her son had launched into history. Roxane and the young Alexander IV fall into Cassander's hands. In 310 before the Common Era, both are quietly murdered. The Argead bloodline, which had ruled Macedonia for generations and produced the Conqueror of Persia, ends in a prison in Amphipolis. In the east, Antigonus, called the One-Eyed, makes the most ambitious attempt to reunify the empire under a single ruler. He and his son Demetrius control Anatolia, Syria, and Greece at various points, and in 306 before the Common Era, Antigonus takes the title of king, the first of the successors to do so openly. The others follow within months. Ptolemy, Seleucus, Cassander, Lysimachus all declare themselves kings, abandoning the fiction of a unified Macedonian empire governed in the name of Alexander's heirs. The empire is now openly, formally divided. The final reckoning comes at Ipsus, in Phrygia, in 301 before the Common Era. Antigonus, aged nearly 80, faces a coalition of Seleucus and Lysimachus on a broad Anatolian plain. Seleucus brings war elephants from his eastern territories, 500 of them, and it is the elephants that decide the battle. When Demetrius pursues the enemy cavalry too far from the main line, the elephants cut off his return. Antigonus, standing in the center of his collapsing formation, is struck by javelins and killed. He is the last man who might plausibly have reunited what Alexander built. With his death on that Phrygian plain, the age of a single Macedonian empire closes permanently. 3 kingdoms rise from the wreckage, and the world Alexander made begins its long transformation into something new. From the wreckage of Ipsus, 3 worlds emerge. They do not rise cleanly or without further war. The decades after 301 before the Common Era are still turbulent, still marked by dynastic murder and shifting borders. But the broad shape of the Hellenistic Age is now fixed. Ptolemy holds Egypt and the Levantine coast. Seleucus controls the vast interior from Syria to the edges of Bactria. Antigonus's son Demetrius eventually loses Macedonia itself to Lysimachus, and after further struggle, Antigonus Gonatas, grandson of the one-eyed general, establishes the Antigonid dynasty firmly in the Macedonian homeland by 276 before the Common Era. 3 kingdoms, 3 capitals, 1 civilization built from the same Macedonian and Greek inheritance, spreading across a world that Alexander's campaigns had permanently opened. Egypt under the Ptolemies becomes the wealthiest and most intellectually brilliant of the 3. Alexandria, founded on the narrow strip of land between Lake Mareotis and the Mediterranean, grows with extraordinary speed. Its streets are laid in a grid, wide, colonnaded, oriented to catch the sea breeze off the northern coast. The royal quarter occupies the northeastern corner of the city, facing the great harbour. There, Ptolemy I and his son Ptolemy II build the Mauseion, the Temple of the Muses, and attached to it, the Great Library. Founded around 295 before the Common Era, the Library of Alexandria becomes the most ambitious intellectual project the ancient world had ever attempted. A collection of all written knowledge in every language gathered from every corner of the Mediterranean and the Near East. Ships entering Alexandria's harbour are searched, and any scrolls found aboard are copied. The originals kept, the copies returned. Scholars from across the Greek-speaking world, mathematicians, poets, physicians, astronomers, geographers, receive stipends to live and work within the Mauseion's colonnaded gardens. Euclid works out the principles of geometry here. Eratosthenes calculates the circumference of the earth with remarkable accuracy. Aristarchus proposes that the earth moves around the sun. The lighthouse of Alexandria, the Pharos, rises on a small island at the harbour mouth, to a height ancient sources place at over 100 meters, its fire visible far out to sea. a beacon not only for sailors, but for the idea that this city stands at the center of the known world. Ptolemy II's grand procession of 271 before the Common Era displays the kingdom's wealth in staggering detail: exotic animals, golden statues, rivers of wine flowing through the streets, a performance of power designed to announce that the Ptolemaic court is the legitimate heir of Alexander's glory. The dynasty rules Egypt for nearly 3 centuries, each Ptolemaic king taking the title of pharaoh, each queen worshipped as a goddess. They build temples in the Egyptian style at Edfu, at Dendera, at Philae, inscribed in hieroglyphics, decorated with traditional Egyptian iconography, while simultaneously funding Greek theatre, Greek philosophy, and Greek athletic games. The fusion is not always comfortable, but it is persistent and productive. To the east, the Seleucid Empire faces a different challenge, governing an enormous territory that stretches from the Aegean coast of Anatolia to the borders of India, encompassing dozens of languages, religions, and administrative traditions. Seleucus I founds his western capital at Antioch on the Orontes River in Syria, a city that grows into one of the largest in the ancient world, its colonnaded main street running 4 kilometers through the city, its population eventually reaching several 100,000. A second capital, Seleucia on the Tigris, rises near the old Babylonian heartland, becoming the commercial hub of the Eastern Empire. The Seleucids plant Greek cities across their territory, in Mesopotamia, in Persia, in Bactria, each with its agora, its gymnasium, its theatre. Greek becomes the language of administration, commerce, and elite culture from the Aegean to the Iranian plateau. Antiochus III, ruling from 223 to 187 before the Common Era, briefly restores Seleucid power to something approaching Alexander's reach, campaigning into Bactria, receiving the submission of Indian border kings, and marching west to reclaim lost territories. But his confrontation with Rome ends in catastrophic defeat at the Battle of Magnesia in 190 before the Common Era, and the subsequent Treaty of Apamea strips the Seleucids of Anatolia and cripples them financially. From that point, the empire contracts steadily, pressed by Parthian expansion from the east and Roman dominance in the west. In Macedonia itself, the Antigonid kingdom is the smallest and most embattled of the 3, yet it remains the ancestral homeland of the Macedonian identity. Antigonus Gonatas builds a stable if modest kingdom, defending against Galatian raids from the north and managing the perpetually restless Greek city-states to the south. The cultural output of the Antigonid court is less spectacular than Alexandria's, but Macedonia remains the military heartland, the source of the phalanx tradition, the sarissa, the cavalry tactics that had once conquered the world. Across all 3 kingdoms, a shared Hellenistic culture takes root. The gymnasium spreads wherever Greek settlers go, not merely as a place of athletic training, but as the institution through which Greek language, literature, and civic identity are transmitted to the next generation. Greek theatre, Greek coinage bearing portrait heads of living kings, Greek philosophical schools, and Greek medical practice spread from the Nile to the Euphrates. In Judea, the pressure of Hellenization provokes the Maccabean revolt of 167 before the Common Era, a fierce resistance to the Seleucid king Antiochus IV's attempt to suppress Jewish religious practice and install a Greek altar in the temple at Jerusalem. The revolt succeeds in establishing a measure of Jewish autonomy, but it also reveals the limits of cultural fusion, the places where the Hellenistic project met a resistance it could not dissolve. The world Alexander built is vast, brilliant, and deeply contested, and on its western horizon, a new power is already casting its shadow. That shadow belongs to Rome. Through the 2nd century before the Common Era, the Roman Republic moves eastward with a methodical patience that the Hellenistic kingdoms consistently underestimate. Rome does not conquer in the manner of Alexander, in a single brilliant stroke across a decade. Rome absorbs province by province, generation by generation, until the world that Alexander built has been folded into something new. Macedonia falls first. The Antigonid kingdom, which had survived the chaos of the Diadochi Wars and the Celtic invasions of the early 3rd century, enters the 2nd century weakened by internal succession disputes and increasingly outmatched by Roman military discipline. The confrontation comes to its defining moment on a plain near the city of Pydna in northern Macedonia, in the summer of 168 before the Common Era. The Roman consul Lucius Aemilius Paulus faces the Macedonian king Perseus, the last Antigonid, across terrain that both sides have carefully chosen. The Macedonian phalanx advances in its ancient formation, sarissas leveled, the wall of iron points that had shattered Persian lines at Gaugamela and broken armies across 3 continents. For a moment the Roman legions give ground. Then the phalanx crosses uneven terrain. The long pikes cannot adjust. Gaps open in the formation. Roman soldiers pour through those gaps, fighting at close quarters where the sarissa is useless. The phalanx collapses from within. Perseus flees. 20,000 Macedonian soldiers die or are captured. The battle lasts less than an hour. Perseus is taken to Rome in chains. He dies in captivity. Macedonia is divided into 4 client republics, stripped of its silver mines and its capacity for unified resistance. 20 years later, after a failed uprising, Rome dispenses with the pretense. In 148 before the Common Era, Macedonia becomes a Roman province, the first piece of the Greek world formally absorbed into the Roman administrative system. The land where the Argead kings had hunted and the companion cavalry had trained is now governed by a Roman praetor. The painted tombs at Aegae stand silent beneath their burial mounds, undisturbed but forgotten. The Seleucid Empire dies more slowly, and from 2 directions simultaneously. From the west, Rome applies pressure through diplomacy and the threat of force. The humiliation at Apamea in 188 before the Common Era strips Antiochus III of his western territories and imposes crippling war indemnities. From the east, the Parthians, a nomadic Iranian people who have built a formidable cavalry empire on the ruins of the eastern Seleucid satrapies, press relentlessly westward. By the mid-2nd century, the Parthians hold Iran and Mesopotamia. The Seleucid realm shrinks to Syria and fragments of the Levant, torn by dynastic civil wars that Rome watches with calculated disinterest. The great Seleucid cities, Antioch, Seleucia on the Tigris, survive, but the empire that built them is hollowed out. By the 1st century before the Common Era, the Seleucid state is a ghost, finally extinguished by the Roman general Pompey in 63 before the Common Era, who reorganizes Syria as a Roman province without ceremony or resistance. Only Egypt endures. The Ptolemaic kingdom, protected by the Nile's geography and enriched by its agricultural surplus, outlasts its sister states by more than a century. But it too is dying, slowly through dynastic weakness, court intrigue, and an ever-deepening dependence on Roman goodwill. The last Ptolemaic ruler of consequence is Cleopatra VII, who comes to power in 51 before the Common Era and navigates the treacherous currents of Roman civil war with extraordinary political intelligence. Her alliances with Julius Caesar and then with Mark Antony keep Egypt nominally independent for 2 decades. But when Antony and Cleopatra are defeated by Octavian at the naval battle of Actium in 31 before the Common Era, the last shield falls. Cleopatra dies in Alexandria on the 30th of August, 30 before the Common Era, by her own hand, according to ancient tradition. Octavian enters the city. He views the body of Alexander in its glass sarcophagus, reportedly placing flowers upon it. Then he closes the tomb. Egypt becomes the Roman province of Aegyptus. The last successor state is gone. The world Alexander made has passed entirely into Roman hands, transformed, absorbed, and yet, in ways that would take centuries to fully understand, permanently alive within the civilization that consumed it. Octavian closes the tomb, and the world moves on. But Alexander does not disappear. He transforms, passing from historical figure into something rarer and stranger, a mirror in which every subsequent civilization sees its own ambitions reflected back. The Roman emperors are first. Julius Caesar, standing before a statue of Alexander in a temple at Gades, is said to have wept, recognizing in the Macedonian king an achievement that dwarfed his own at the same age. Augustus, inheriting the world Octavian conquered, deliberately models his public image on Alexandrine iconography, the upward gaze, the slightly parted lips, the sense of a man touched by something beyond ordinary mortality. Trajan marches to the Persian Gulf in 116 of the Common Era, and reportedly laments that he is too old to go further east, as Alexander had gone. Caracalla, 2 centuries after Augustus, dresses soldiers in Macedonian fashion, calls his personal guard the Argyraspides, the Silver Shields, and makes pilgrimage to Alexander's tomb in Alexandria. The imitation is not mere vanity. These emperors understand that Alexander represents the outer limit of what a single human will can accomplish against the resistance of the world. The Greek language Alexander carried east outlasts every political structure he built. When the earliest Christian scriptures are written down in the 1st century of the Common Era, they are written in Greek, the common tongue of the Eastern Mediterranean that Hellenistic civilization had seeded across 3 centuries. The theological vocabulary of early Christianity, logos, pneuma, cosmos, is Greek. The intellectual framework within which early Christian thinkers argue, debate, and define doctrine is shaped by Platonic and Stoic philosophy, both products of the Hellenistic world. Alexandria, the city Alexander founded on the Egyptian coast, becomes the site where Greek philosophy and Jewish scripture and emerging Christian theology meet and interpenetrate. The shadow is long and runs through the foundations of Western religion itself. Eastward, the legacy travels differently. In the Islamic tradition, a figure called Dhul Qarnayn, the 2-horned one, appears in the 18th chapter of the Quran, a righteous king who travels to the ends of the earth, east and west, and builds a great barrier against the forces of chaos. Medieval Islamic scholars debate the identification at length. Many conclude that Dhul Qarnayn is Alexander, or at least draws on the Alexander legend as it circulated through Persian and Syriac traditions. The Alexander Romance, a fictional elaboration of his life composed in Greek and then translated into Syriac, Pahlavi, Arabic, Persian, and eventually every major language of the medieval world, makes him a prophet, a philosopher-king, a seeker of the water of life. In Persian miniature paintings from the 14th and 15th centuries, Iskandar, the Persian name for Alexander, appears in jeweled robes, attended by angels, consulting with the sage Aristotle, or gazing into a magical mirror that reveals the secrets of the world. In the highlands of northern Greece, the archaeology quietly continues. In 1977, the Greek archaeologist Manolis Andronikos opens a burial mound at Vergina, ancient Aegae, and finds an intact royal tomb. Inside a stone chamber, a gold larnax engraved with the 16-pointed star of the Argead dynasty holds cremated bones wrapped in purple and gold cloth. A golden diadem rests nearby. The bones show evidence of a healed leg wound consistent with ancient accounts of Philip II's injuries. The find electrifies the scholarly world. In 2018, the site receives recognition from the United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization as a monument of outstanding universal value. The painted tomb chambers, the gold and ivory artifacts, the silver vessels, all speak from a silence of more than 2,300 years. In Afghanistan, French archaeologists discover in 1964 the ruins of a city on the Oxus River, Ai-Khanoum, with a Greek theatre, a gymnasium, philosophical inscriptions copied from Delphi, and Corinthian column capitals rising from Central Asian soil. It is a genuine Hellenistic city, built and inhabited by Greek settlers at the far edge of the world Alexander reached. The city was abandoned and eventually destroyed, but its foundations remain, proof that the civilization carried east by Macedonian soldiers took root, however briefly, in the most improbable of soils. The modern dispute over Alexander's identity, contested between Greece and North Macedonia as a matter of national heritage and political symbolism, reveals how alive the question of ownership remains. 2,300 years have not settled who Alexander belongs to. Perhaps that is the truest measure of his reach, that he belongs, in some irreducible way, to all of it, to the Macedonian plain, to the Persian plateau, to the Nile Delta, to the Hindu Kush, and to every civilization that has since looked back at the ancient world and found, still standing at its center, the figure of a young king who believed the edge of the world was always one more march away. Thank you sincerely for watching this journey through one of history's most extraordinary stories. If these episodes have sparked your curiosity, please subscribe to the channel so you never miss what comes next.